And welcome to the next set of slides for A&P, or Anatomy Physiology for Massage 1. The next thing I'd like to speak to you about is standardization. If you can imagine, when the science of anatomy first started, we were looking at things and people had all kinds of ideas, and we were having the opportunity to look inside a human body, and we needed a standardized way to represent where things were, how things related to each other, and the ability to do that would ensure that if I was teaching a class like I am now, or two healthcare practitioners were speaking to each other, we were talking a language and we were using terms that would ensure a shortcut to being able to discuss what we were discussing about, and B, insurance that what I was speaking you completely understood and there was no loss of communication between the two. So when we first started looking at a human body, if you can imagine, we had to start from our ability to standardize a view of the body that under any circumstance it would be the same thing, whether a body was upside down, sideways, backwards, on a table, on a floor, whatever it may be. So what was adopted was something called the anatomical position. Here you see it in the diagram. It is a body that is erect with the palms faced forward and the toes flat. So when we are talking about something, it is always from this position. So if I'm telling you that the thumb lies lateral to the first finger, even though that hand you're looking at may be in a different position in front of you, the relationship between those two structures is still based upon the anatomical position. So always keep in mind that everything I discuss when it comes to a relationship between organs, a relationship between bones, the movements of a shoulder joint or a hip joint, it is always based upon this anatomical position. I'll be reminding you of that throughout the course as we move through. So that's the first step. The first standardization was the position of the human body to relationship. The next thing we had to look at was, when we look at a human body in the anatomical position and we start to discuss structures within this dynamic body and the relationship between structures, we had to come to some form of terminology in those relationships. So the very first one is superior, inferior. Superior is moving to the top or above. Inferior is moving down or a relationship of below. For example, the nose lies superior to the mouth. Conversely, you could say that the mouth lies inferior to the nose. So what just happened there? When we're looking at the body in the anatomical position and we look at the nose and the mouth, and we say that the nose lies superior to the mouth, but that the mouth lies inferior to the nose, what have we done? We have changed our reference point. So that is something to always think about and consider when we discuss a relationship between two structures. We can change the reference point when we're referring to a structure, whether it be behind or in front or on top of or underneath. The other thing I want to say is that I will no longer be using above or below. I will be using superior, inferior, and so forth, all the things we're talking about here when I am discussing structures, and I highly recommend that you remind your teachers in other classes to continue using these terms. It will only make it easier and faster for you to start utilizing them and understanding them yourself. So as I said, the first is superior, up or above. The second is inferior, down or below. The other thing that can be used, and you'll find this in anatomy a lot, there's two ways to say the same thing. Some may use the term cranial or cephalad for superior, and some may use the term caudal for down or below. Cranial represents the head or above, caudal represents tail or below. So superior cranial and inferior caudal can be used interchangeably depending on the author you're looking at. Generally in our program, we do tend to use the terms superior and inferior, but the reason I bring these others up is because you may find other terminology in textbooks that you're reading. The next directional reference is anterior and posterior. Anterior represents to the front, and posterior represents to the back. So for example, the belly button lies anterior to the spine, whereas the spine lies posterior to the belly button. Again, think of the reference point that I'm using. And much like superior and inferior, there is also other terms that can be utilized in the context of anterior and posterior. Anterior can also be ventral, and posterior can be dorsal. The best way to remember that is think of a fish and its dorsal fin, that's the big fin on its back. Stand a fish up in the anatomical position and that dorsal fin will be to the back. So superior, inferior, superior up, inferior down, superior above, superior below. Anterior is to the front or in front of, and posterior is to the back or behind. And that generally tends to be seen in the lateral view that you're seeing here in the diagram. The next is medial and lateral. Medial is to the middle, and lateral is to the outside. So, if we think of the body and divide it in half, down the middle through the nose, down through the groin, we could say, in the anatomical position, that the great toe or the big toe is medial to the little toe. Conversely, we can say that the little toe is lateral to the big toe. So big toe is medial to the little toe when we use the big toe as a reference, and the little toe is lateral to the big toe when we use the little toe as a reference. The key thing to remember is medial is to the middle and lateral is to the outside. Quite often, those terms are used in the movements of the limbs. The next you see in here is proximal and distal. Proximal is a term, proximal and distal are terms that are normally used just for the limbs. Proximal is more to the center of the body, and distal is more to the end of the limb away from the body. So let's use the arm for an example. We could say that the shoulder lies proximal to the elbow. We could also say that the hand lies distal to the elbow. The elbow in the hand reference, so the hand lies distal to the elbow is closer to the center of the body, hence the reason why the hand is distal. But when we look at the shoulder being proximal to the elbow, the shoulder lies closer to the mid-body than the elbow does. So remember, proximal is closer to, distal is farther away. So we could also say that the groin lies proximal to the knee, but we could also say that the foot lies distal to the knee. Now, we can still use the same reference points that we used in superior inferior. We could also say that the knee lies proximal to the foot, but the foot lies distal to the knee. So always kind of keep that in mind. The last is the simplest one because it's used throughout anything not being anatomical, and that is something that's superficial and something that's deep. Obviously, superficial would represent something that's closer to the surface of the body, and deep would represent something that's deeper to the body. Where you'll tend to see those things is when we start looking at the relationship between structures under the skin, such as muscles. So what we did was, if we go back just a stop, when we look at standardization, The first thing we did is we standardized the position of the body when we start representing the relationships of things anatomically. The second thing we did is we standardized terminology that would help represent movement, direction, and the relationship of structures in the body. The third thing we had to do is, in looking at this body, is we realized that this body isn't smooth. It's lumpy and bumpy. There's things all over the place. And that within these structures, we had to name the areas of them. In this diagram here, what you see, these are the common surface regions of the body. For example, around the belly button is the umbilical region. The area where you get a needle when they take blood from you is known as the antecubital. The brachial area is the upper arm. The antebrachial is the forearm or the lower area. The front of the shin is the crural area, whereas the back of the shin is the sural area. The space behind the knee is the popliteal area. The bum is known as the gluteal region. The face has broken down into orbital of the eyes, buccal, which is the cheeks, nasal represents the nose, oral the mouth, cervical is the neck, acromial is part of the shoulder. We get to the outside of the shoulder, edges of the shoulder is the deltoid, where the shoulder blade is known as the scapula, and so forth. These terms I will be using from here on in throughout the semester. You will also be using them in your theory class. We will also be using them in your clinical anatomy class. You'll also be using them in your labs, because this is how we're going to represent the surface area of the body. So again, anatomical position, direction and relationship of structures, and we started naming the areas of this physical body that we were looking at. The next thing we had to do was start dividing the body into planes. And there are 3 basic planes in the body. There's actually 4, but the 3 standard ones are something called the coronal plane. The coronal plane divides the body into an anterior and posterior portion. So think of the coronal plane cutting right through the middle of your ear, dividing your head into right and left, into front and back, dividing your shoulder and back, and so forth. So the coronal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior. The sagittal plane divides the body into left and right portions. The sagittal plane that runs right through the middle of your head and divides your nose, your chest, right through the groin, this is known as the mid-sagittal plane. It is dividing the body into an equal right and left side, leaving the legs whole on left side or right side. If that sagittal plane moves away from the mid and starts slicing the body from a superior inferior away from the center line, that is known as a perisagittal plane. Okay? So we've got the coronal plane that divides the body into anterior and posterior. We now have the sagittal plane. The mid-sagittal plane divides the body into right and left equally, and the perisagittal plane is anything that divides the body into right and left other than the midsection. The third is known as the transverse plane, and it's exactly that. It crosses the body transversely and divides the body into superior and inferior portions. Similar to the sagittal plane, that transverse plane can move up or down accordingly. The only difference is the transverse or cross-sectional plane doesn't change names if it moves up or down, it remains the same. The one plane that is not on here, it's not as common a plane, is known as an oblique plane, and that is a plane that can slice the body on the bias or on an angle. It's not considered one of the traditional planes, but we do tend to see it. Where does this come into practice? Well, when you look in your anatomy books, you will see pictures and or diagrams where the body is cut along one of these planes to show the structures or organs from that view. So you may see the body cut in a frontal plane showing one or the other sagittal plane and so forth. That's where these come in handy. The body is sometimes divided. So we have the anatomical position, we have the relationships and the movement terminology, and we have the surface areas of the body and the name, and we have the planes. So this is a way we standardize and break the body apart and look at it, and the terminology we use when we discuss and or try to express, define, or explain parts of the body. So once that was done, imagine, if you will, that we had a dead body, a species of human body on a table, and we wanted to do a dissection. So we're at the beginnings of the science of human anatomy, and after we sort of took the body apart and took the organs out and the lungs and so forth, we discovered that within the body these various structures existed in cavities. So there's actually open spaces in the body, or containers, that contain structures. We had to first off name or standardize the names of those cavities, again, in order to express anatomical science. So there are two major cavities of the human body. Within those two major cavities, there are subdivisions. So the first is the dorsal body cavity, and if you remember correctly, dorsal represents back. So the dorsal cavity contains the brain and the spinal cord. So there is a subdivision of the dorsal cavity. It is divided into the cranial cavity, which contains the brain, and the spinal cavity, which contains the spinal cord. And you will see here shortly in the picture that you can see the division between the two. The second major cavity is the ventral body cavity. Remember, ventral means to the front or the front. The ventral body cavity is the larger of the two, and it is subdivided into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. So we'll see here in this diagram, we have the dorsal body cavities in orange, which represents the cranial cavity, the brain, and the vertebral cavity, the spinal cord. The other parts, the purple, the pink, and the green, are the ventral body cavities, and that ventral body cavity is divided into the thoracic cavity, with the diaphragm as a border, and then the pink and the green together form the abdominal pelvic cavity. There is no muscle like the diaphragm that divides the two. Anatomically, though, we generally do tend to separate the abdominal pelvic cavity into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, and we'll get back to that in a moment. So let's continue with the ventral cavities, because the dorsal was pretty straightforward. Let's take this first subdivision of the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is basically where we find the ribs and the muscles of the chest. The thoracic cavity is further divided into smaller parts that contain very specific organs. So we have two pleural cavities, which contain the right and left lung. We have something called the mediastinum, which contains the pericardial cavity, which is where we find the heart, and the remaining thoracic organs, where we find the esophagus, trachea, and other structures. So we see here in the diagram, in here we see that we have in purple the two pleural cavities for the lungs. We have the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart, in teal, and we have the mediastinum, which contains a number of structures. So that represents the thoracic cavity, and so the ventral cavity and the thoracic cavity and its subdivisions within the thoracic cavity. The next one is the abdominal pelvic cavity. There is a demarcation or border between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, and that is the diaphragm. So anything above the diaphragm is considered to be in the thoracic cavity. Anything below the diaphragm is considered to be in the abdominal pelvic cavity. There are two parts to the abdominal pelvic cavity, which I sort of alluded to earlier, but they're not separated by a muscular or membranous wall. The abdominal cavity is the higher one, or the superior one, and the pelvic cavity is the inferior one. Within the abdominal cavity, we find the stomach, the intestines, the spleen, the liver, and other organs. The pelvic cavity contains the bladder, some reproductive organs, and the rectum. Obviously, in females, the majority of the reproductive organs would be in the pelvic cavity, and in the male, some of the reproductive organs would be found in the pelvic cavity, and as well as I said, the rectum. So we see here in the diagram that we have the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity here, the purple or the pink, representing the abdominal cavity, and the green representing the pelvic. Remembering that the major digestive organs exist in the abdominal cavity, and that the reproductive, urinary, and the lower parts of the digestive system exist in the green or the pelvic cavity. Within these cavities, I spoke that there are organs. These organs and the cavities themselves are lined with a membrane. Imagine, if you will, in the abdominal pelvic cavity, we have a lot of stuff in there. We have the stomach, we have the spleen, we have the pancreas, we have the liver, we have the large intestine, we have the small intestine, we have the bladder, the prostate, the uterus, the ovaries, and so forth. How do we keep all this in place? And how are they able to move around and so forth in their relationships? The first thing is that the ventral cavity and the outer surfaces of the visceral organs that we find in there are covered by what is called a thin double-layered membrane known as the serous membrane or the serosa. So the outside of the organs and the cavities themselves in these ventral cavities are covered with this serous membrane or serosa. The part of the membrane that lines the cavity walls, so whether it's the abdominal pelvic cavity or the pleural cavity or the pericardial cavity, what lines those? If we remove the organs, there is a lining that fills that cavity, that lines that cavity. That is known as the parietal serosa. The parietal serosa folds in on itself to form the visceral serosa, which covers the organs that are found in the cavity. So the parietal serosa covers the empty cavity. The parietal serosa folds in on itself to create the visceral serosa, which covers the organs that sit in the cavity. What's unique about these serosa membranes is that they have particular cells that produce a fluid called serous fluid. And what's important about the serous fluid, it allows all these organs to move around in this cavity slippery-wise without causing any irritation. In fact, it works so well. Right now, sitting there, your organs are moving about and you are not even aware of it, because this serous fluid between these two layers is allowing these organs to move around and interact amongst themselves without any friction. When we say that something is double layered, it means that between the two layers there is something called a potential space. So if I was able to go into a body and separate the parietal serosa, I would see it had two layers with a fluid in between. That space between those two layers is called a potential space, because without a microscope, if you looked at it, you would think that there was no space at all. In fact, when we look at the fluid that exists between the two layers, it's basically only a cell or two wide that allows for this frictionless movement between the two membranes. You'll see here on the slide it says page 19 of Tortora. So if you want to go to your Tortora book and look at page 19, it does show and explain to some degree about these membranes. But you will also see in what I've got here in this picture, you will see here particularly on the one on the left, you will see that around the lungs, so if I want to sort of get a sense of where we are, if we look here on the top section, we'll see that there is a transverse plane that cuts through the body. The top part of the lungs, the head and the shoulders have all been removed, and we are looking down upon here the spinal cord, sort of some cutaway ribs, the heart, and the two lungs. Okay, so the shoulder and head has been removed. We have an inferior view along a transverse plane looking down at these structures. You will note that there's a gray area here that surrounds each of the lungs and also surrounds the heart. All right. You will also note that between the two gray areas there is a darker space. Now the artist has deliberately drawn a little wider space here so that you can get a sense of the space that actually does exist between the two layers of the serous membrane. It is in this dark area that you find this serous fluid that allows these to move without any friction. Imagine every time you breathe in, your lungs get larger, and every time you breathe out, your lungs get smaller. The ability for that to happen and you not feel it is because the interaction between these two layers, the parietal layer here, which lies against the membrane, and the visceral layer here, which lies against the lung itself, between the two there is this slippery fluid which allows the lungs to expand and contract without you even noticing that it's happening. Okay, so we see here that when the cavity is lined, it is known as the parietal layer, and when this membrane lines the organ itself, it is known as the visceral layer. If we look over here on the right, this is a mid-sagittal cut that's happened. So we're looking at the body from a sagittal plane cut. And we see here the liver, part of the stomach, the large intestine, the small intestine, and so forth. And we see here that all this space, all these organs are lined with white. And imagine, if you will, that the potential space lies there, and all these organs are lined up against each other with two layers of lining with fluid in between, which allows them all to sort of move around, somewhat interact with each other, and not cause any friction between the two of them. Now, remember, the parietal membrane lines the cavity, and the visceral membrane lines the organ. The next step we do is we start to specialize specific serous membranes. How we specialize specific serous membranes is to name them in accordance to the particular organ or organs that they're somewhat related to. So the first are the serous membranes that relate to the heart. When they relate to the heart, we use the term cardium. So because they surround the heart, and you start on your medical terminology in the A&P class, something that surrounds, the medical term is peri. So the parietal pericardium tells you that this serous membrane lines the cavity that the heart sits in. So parietal meaning lines the cavity. Pericardium means it's related to around the heart. So the parietal pericardium lines the pericardial cavity. The visceral pericardium, if we remember, the serous membrane that covers the organ is known visceral. So the visceral pericardium is the lining that covers the heart. Remember, they're called pericardium because they relate to the space and the organ of the space that the heart sits in, and the organ itself, the heart. Number 3 and number 4, specific serous membranes relate to the lungs. Therefore, because it relates to the lungs, we use the term pleura. The parietal pleura lines the cavity walls of the thoracic cavity where the lungs do lie. The visceral pleura is the serous membrane that covers the lungs themselves. So the parietal pleura lines the wall of the cavity that houses the lungs, and the visceral pleura is the membrane that covers the lungs themselves. The last specific serous membrane is the membranes that are involved with the abdominal pelvic region. And when we look at that, all the organs that are found in there, the stomach, the liver, the spleen, the pancreas, the intestines, and so forth, they collectively are known as the peritoneum. So the parietal peritoneum is the serous membrane that lines or covers the walls of the abdominal pelvic cavity, whereas the visceral peritoneum is the serous membranes that covers most of the organs that lie in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So I'll repeat, the parietal peritoneum lines the wall of the abdominal pelvic cavity, whereas the visceral peritoneum covers most of the organs that lie in the abdominal pelvic cavity. The next slide is further specialization of the peritoneum, and there are large folds of the tissue of the peritoneum, and these large folds have particular responsibility. Some parts of the folds weave between the organs and help hold them together and provide a tissue whereby nerves and blood vessels and lymphatic vessels can enter and leave the organs. And we also find that it holds them in place. There are a couple of specific peritoneal folds. The first is called the greater omentum. So if I want to sort of get you oriented here, this is the human heart. This is the edge of the diaphragm. This is the liver. This is the stomach. This big yellow material is the greater omentum. And behind there, you will find all of the large and small intestine. So the greater omentum is the largest fold. It drapes over the transverse colon and the small intestine, kind of like a fatty apron. It's quite thick. It contains a large amount of adipose tissue or fat. If you happen to have someone in the family who's got the big beer belly, sounds like the ripe watermelon, the big tummy. It is not fat between the skin and the muscle that's caused that tummy to stick out. It's because of the fat that's collected in the greater omentum. It is pushing against the backside of the abdominal wall in the visceral area where the organs are. And there is so much fat in that greater omentum, it's pushing the skin out that creates this big, what we know as the beer belly. The lesser omentum, very similar. It's an anterior fold as well, contains a lot of fat, but both the greater omentum and the lesser omentum also contain a lot of what's called connective tissue, because their other responsibility is to help kind of hold things in place. So basically what the lesser omentum does here, it connects the stomach here to the liver and to the duodenum, which you can't quite see here. It's kind of in behind. It kind of lies here. And the duodenum is the transition between the stomach and the small intestine. So very similar. It's a lesser omentum. Same idea, contains fat, and much like the greater omentum, also contains connective tissue which kind of helps hold things into place. We can see here more in a drawing than in a photograph. We see the lesser and greater omentum here. So we said the lesser attaches the stomach to the liver, which we see here in the diagram, and the greater covers the small intestines like an apron. It is in essence a bit of a part of protection to the abdominal organs. If you think about it, the lungs and the heart are protected by a nice bony cage of the rib cage. But the abdominal organs are not. There's all soft tissue there. So this is an example of structure and function where the body has something like this, a folding of tissue, which not only contains blood vessels and nerves, but also provides some minor protection to the organs that lie in behind it. The next tissue that we find here in the peritoneum is something called the mesentery. It is again a bit of connective tissue. It's fan-shaped, and it holds the parts of the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. In fact, if any of you did any dissections of a fetal pig or a frog, and you had to, if you remember correctly, you had to cut the tissue away from the small intestine, lay it all out and measure it, what you were in fact cutting at that time was the mesentery that was holding all those small intestine in place. It's the largest fold of all. It is laden with lots of fat. It extends from the posterior abdominal wall. It wraps around the small intestine and then turns back to its original attachment on the posterior abdominal wall. It too contains large amounts of nerves and blood vessels. It's very, very vascular. And in a moment here, you'll see where I have a diagram of it. This is the picture here where you can see this is the small intestine. You can see the mesentery is kind of holding it in place with connective tissue. But what I want you to note is there is a massive amount of blood vessels here, and it is these blood vessels that help feed the small intestine, keep it healthy. But within here is also very specific specialized lymphatic vessels, which actually grab some of the nutrients that are being broken down and absorbed in the small intestine and returning back to the body. So that's the diagram. You'll see, or the picture, you'll see here in the diagram, the small intestines have been removed, and in the green you can see where the mesentery is that holds all the intestines in place. And of course you can see here further in this other drawing where the mesentery shows a nice artery in through it, where how it holds the 3 sections of small intestines in place. Thank you, and that concludes the next slide, slide set, which is all on the cavities and the membranes of the human body.